Al-Farabi's early life began in the remote yet culturally breathing region of Farab, located on the steppeland edges of Transoxiana, where Turkic, Persian, and Arabic influences quietly intertwined. The city was neither a grand imperial capital nor a forgotten settlement. It existed in a space between worlds, nourished by caravan roads, nomadic encampments, and the slow movement of ideas across the Silk Route. In this environment, the young Farabi grew up hearing multiple languages, watching traders negotiate under dusty light, and seeing religious scholars debate philosophy beside merchants selling grain. Such a setting would later shape him into a thinker capable of bridging civilizations. But in childhood, it simply meant that knowledge was something one could witness in everyday life, carried on the wind like the sound of horse hooves or prayer. Life in Farab was marked by extremes: bitter winters, sunburnt summers, and long distances between settlements. Yet within those vast horizons lay a kind of freedom, room for thought, for observation, for curiosity. Farabi's earliest memories may have been of river reeds swaying along the Sir Daria, nomads tending their herds across broad grasslands, and craftsmen carving tools with quiet precision. The landscape itself encouraged reflection. Farabi's teachers would not only be the scholars of the region, but also the natural rhythm of steppe life, the migrations of birds, the structure of tents, the geometry of irrigation canals. Every element held a lesson if one observed closely enough. The household into which he was born likely valued discipline, learning, and service, as many accounts suggest that his family had connections to military or administrative roles under local rulers. This granted him access to basic education in languages and foundational sciences even at an early age. Still, Farab's intellectual hunger went beyond what regular instruction could satisfy. He was known to spend evenings listening to discussions among travelers newly arrived from distant lands, scholars from Baghdad, astronomers from Khwarezm, musicians from cities he had never seen. These encounters offered glimpses of a wider world and planted silent questions that would accompany him through life. From this mixture of cultural exchange, harsh landscape, and quiet scholarly discipline, Al-Farabi's identity began to take shape. His birthplace was not merely a point on a map, but a living classroom, a meeting ground of steppe wisdom and urban scholarship. The boy who would later be called the second teacher, after Aristotle first opened his eyes here, in a land where knowledge traveled like caravans, slowly but endlessly. Farab did not simply witness his early growth. It formed the very architecture of his thought, giving him a foundation broad enough to hold mathematics, music, logic, and metaphysics within one lifetime. Al-Farabi's family belonged to a social world shaped by the crossroads of military duty, scholarly tradition, and the mixed heritage of the Central Asian frontier. Many accounts associate his father with a position in the local garrison, a role that would have placed the household within a disciplined, orderly structure where responsibility and obedience were expected as naturally as breathing. Yet the domestic atmosphere was not rigid in the manner of a barracks. Rather, it reflected a harmony between practicality and learning. The family lived close to the administrative centers of their region, where officials recorded tax ledgers beside poets reciting verses in Persian. In such an environment, a child was not merely raised but shaped, surrounded by the constant interplay between governance, culture, and intellectual curiosity. The cultural fabric of Farabi's lineage was woven from diverse threads. Turkic tribal traditions flowed through oral storytelling, music, and communal gatherings, while Persian literary influence arrived through handwritten manuscripts and traveling reciters who carried epic tales like precious cargo. Islamic scholarship, spreading through newly established learning circles, introduced the young thinker to the discipline of logic, grammar, and metaphysical thought. His family did not exist on the sidelines of these traditions. They inhabited the living point where they met and merged. The songs heard during winter nights, the poetic metaphors exchanged at public gatherings, and the philosophical sermons delivered at mosques all composed the atmosphere of his earliest education. Within the household, learning was considered a form of duty as much as an aspiration. Elders encouraged boys to read widely and listen deeply, understanding that knowledge could elevate a person beyond the limitations of geography. The Farabi family home likely held more scrolls and ink than luxury, its wealth measured in ideas rather than coin. Young Al-Farabi was exposed to mathematical problems, legal reasoning, and the art of structured debate long before he knew the scale of their importance. Intellectual pursuit was not confined to formal lessons. It lived in conversation, in observation, and in the willingness to ask why the world worked as it did. The blending of cultural currents in his family background created a rare foundation, one that prepared him to navigate multiple intellectual worlds without losing himself in any single one. From this soil grew a mind comfortable with plurality, able to carry the wisdom of nomads alongside the precision of philosophers. His cultural roots did not simply anchor him, they gave him breadth, elasticity, and an instinct for synthesis. In later years, when he would shape new paths in philosophy, music theory, and political thought, the echoes of his upbringing, military discipline, scholarly respect, and cultural mosaic would still resonate softly beneath his ideas, like the deep pulse of a distant drum signaling where he first belonged. Al-Farabi's earliest education unfolded in a modest yet intellectually awake environment, where learning was not reserved for elites, but encouraged as a pathway to discipline and self-mastery. His childhood teachers were likely drawn from local scholarly circles, individuals trained in Arabic grammar, jurisprudence, and the foundational sciences that were rapidly spreading through Central Asia. Lessons took place in simple settings, beneath shaded courtyards, inside mud brick study rooms, or even outdoors when weather allowed. Here, the young student learned to handle reed pens, calculate with pebble counting boards, and recite poetry that demanded both memory and interpretation. Education was not gentle. It required stamina. A child might spend hours repeating a single line of text until every sound flowed like water across stone. What set Farabi apart was not merely access to teachers, but the intensity with which he absorbed their instruction. While many students learned only what was required, he pushed further, lingering after lessons to ask questions about logic, cosmology, and the structure of language. Early instructors, impressed by his curiosity, introduced him to texts beyond the standard curriculum: manuals on dialectics, treatises on moral philosophy, and early compendiums of astronomy. His first teachers were not grand figures in historical records, yet they shaped him decisively. They represented the link between tradition and innovation, guiding him through the formal framework of classical learning while encouraging the instinct to inquire beyond it. Another defining feature of his education was exposure to multiple linguistic systems. He studied Arabic for scholarly discourse, Persian for literature and poetry, and likely interacted with Turkic dialects spoken in the households and marketplaces around him. This multilingual environment trained his mind for comparative thinking, enabling him to decipher meaning across cultural boundaries. Teachers emphasized not only memorization, but also the elegance of reasoning, how a sentence could carry both clarity and beauty, how an argument could be constructed like architecture, precise, balanced, and enduring. It was in these early sessions that Farabi began to see knowledge not as a collection of facts, but as a structure whose foundation demanded logic and patience. By the time he reached adolescence, those who had guided his first steps recognized they were no longer teaching an ordinary pupil. He developed a reputation for sustained focus, staying awake by lamplight to copy texts, studying geometry diagrams traced on the ground, and analyzing arguments until he understood not just their answer, but their soul. His teachers served as gateways, not destinations. They unlocked doors, but he was the one who insisted on walking through them. These formative years created the intellectual discipline that would later carry him to the great centers of scholarship in Baghdad and beyond. The seeds of his future brilliance were planted quietly here, in classrooms filled with ink, dust, and the rustle of parchment, a beginning humble in appearance, yet monumental in consequence. Al-Farabi's decision to leave his homeland marked the first major turning point in his intellectual life. The distant cities of Bukhara and Samarkand were already renowned as rising centers of scholarship, places where libraries grew like orchards, and scholars debated from dawn until the call to night prayer. The young philosopher, still unknown beyond his birthplace, joined trading caravans or scholarly groups moving westward across the steppe. The journey was long and exposed him to harsh winds, shifting sands, and the constant rhythm of hooves against earth. Yet each mile carried promise, the possibility of deeper learning, new teachers, and access to manuscripts unavailable in Farab. Travel, for him, was not merely relocation, it was a necessary pilgrimage on the path of understanding. Upon reaching Bukhara, he entered an atmosphere unlike anything he had known. The city was alive with intellectual noise, scribes copying theological texts in market squares, astronomers observing planetary movement from clay-built observatories, and poets reciting verses in Persian courts where rulers rewarded brilliance with silver and silk. Here, Farabi found structured academies where debates were not just tolerated, but expected. He absorbed teachings in logic, ethics, music, and mathematics from scholars who had themselves studied in Persia or Baghdad. Nights were spent in candlelit lecture halls where oil lamps flickered beneath vaulted ceilings, and no subject was too vast to question. The young man who had once studied in quiet village courtyards now found himself navigating oceans of knowledge. Samarkand, farther along the route of learning, offered an even broader horizon. Scholars from India, China, and the Islamic heartlands crossed paths in its libraries, bringing with them unfamiliar books and philosophies. Farabi encountered new approaches to astronomy, refined mathematical theories, and discussions that blended Greek heritage with evolving Islamic thought. In the markets, he heard dialects and music styles he had never imagined, each carrying its own intellectual fingerprint. Observing these differences sharpened his analytical mind. Knowledge was no longer a single river, but a network of streams flowing from many civilizations. In Samarkand, he learned not only from teachers, but from the diversity of thought itself, a living mosaic of ideas. These travels transformed Farabi from a promising student into a seeker of universal truths. His notebooks grew heavy with copied diagrams, philosophical excerpts, and personal reflections that hinted at future theories. He walked through gardens where scholars argued beneath pomegranate trees. sat beside astronomers who charted the midday sun, and listened to musicians whose melodies stirred his developing interest in sound theory. The journey to Bukhara and Samarkand was not defined by arrival, but by expansion, of mind, of perspective, of purpose. When he finally departed to continue his quest elsewhere, he carried with him the intellectual wealth of two great cities, imprinted like constellations across his memory, guiding him towards the next stage of his scholarly pilgrimage. When Al-Farabi reached Baghdad, he stepped into a world where knowledge was not only preserved, but constantly forged anew. The city was the beating heart of intellectual life, its libraries glowing like lanterns in a vast night of inquiry. Scholars from every corner of the Islamic world and beyond gathered there, speaking in many tongues, exchanging rare manuscripts, testing each other's logic, and expanding the boundaries of philosophy. For Farabi, Baghdad was more than a destination. It was a crucible. The moment he entered its study halls and lecture rooms, surrounded by shelves heavy with Aristotle, Galen, and Alexander of Aphrodisias, he recognized that his journey had changed direction. He was no longer only absorbing knowledge, but preparing to build upon it. In Baghdad's renowned academies, especially the House of Wisdom, he found teachers who opened vast intellectual landscapes before him. Under the guidance of philosophers trained in the Greek tradition, he mastered logic to a degree that few of his contemporaries could match. He studied Aristotelian thought not as static doctrine, but as a living system that demanded interpretation and reconstruction. Mornings might involve dissection of metaphysical texts, afternoons devoted to geometry, astronomy, and the physics of sound, evenings to debates that stretched well past midnight. Students argued in circles where every claim required evidence, and Farabi, quiet yet precise, earned admiration not through volume, but through clarity, his words cutting through confusion like a blade through silk. Music, too, became a field in which he excelled. Baghdad's bustling soundscape, chants from mosques, rhythms of street performers, refined court orchestras, offered raw material for inquiry. Farabi analyzed intervals, instruments, and the mathematical ratios behind melody. He transformed listening into science and later into theory, drafting frameworks that endured for centuries. In circles of musicians and scholars, he was both observer and participant, learning how harmony could reflect cosmic order. Baghdad allowed him to weave together philosophy and sound, reason and rhythm, until they formed a unified language of knowledge. Years in the city refined him into something far greater than the promising student who had once crossed dusty plains in search of learning. Baghdad gave him access not only to books, but to intellectual confrontation, creativity, and struggle. He walked through its gardens deep in thought, paced library corridors with manuscripts under his arm, and filled his notebooks with evolving interpretations. Here, his ideas matured, slowly, like iron heating in a smith's fire. By the time he left Baghdad to continue his scholarly path, Al-Farabi no longer merely followed the footsteps of Aristotle. He had begun to leave his own prints beside them. The city had served its purpose. It had not finished him. It had forged him. Al-Farabi's mastery of logic did not develop suddenly. It grew through relentless dissection of thought, word, and reasoning, until logic became not merely a subject for him, but a living architecture through which the mind arranged reality. In Baghdad, he approached Aristotle's works like a craftsman examining every joint of a structure, testing whether each premise carried its weight. While many scholars recited the texts, Farabi reconstructed them, parsing statements into logical units and rebuilding arguments with sharpened clarity. He treated syllogism like geometry: precise, measurable, elegant. Over time, he gained a reputation for explaining Greek logic more clearly than anyone else of his era, as if he could illuminate hidden corridors within ancient philosophic halls. His commentaries did not repeat. They refined, expanded, and clarified concepts that had long remained elusive. It was this power of explanation that earned him the title Muallim al-Thani, the second teacher after Aristotle himself. Farabi studied the relationship between reason and existence, tracing how the human mind forms universal concepts, how it distinguishes truth from illusion, and how knowledge progresses step by step toward certainty. In philosophical gatherings, he often listened silently before responding with calm precision, presenting arguments so structured that even opponents found themselves nodding. Observers described him as a thinker who did not merely debate, but built intellectual landscapes piece by piece. He showed how logic could serve as the foundation of society, science, governance, and ethics, an all-encompassing blueprint for human understanding. From logic, Farabi moved naturally into metaphysics. He contemplated the nature of the first cause, the structure of the cosmos, and the hierarchy of intellect. His worldview placed God as the source of existence and reason, radiating knowledge through successive intellects like light cascading through crystal. Humanity, in his view, approached truth by refining the mind through discipline and contemplation. Philosophy, therefore, was not just an academic craft, but a spiritual journey. He believed that through reason, the soul could ascend toward the highest understanding, where knowledge and virtue converged. His treatises linked metaphysics to political theory, music, and psychology, showing that all fields of inquiry shared one origin and one goal: the perfection of human intellect. What makes Farabi's mastery remarkable is not only the breadth of subjects he commanded, but the unity he forged among them. Logic, for him, was the instrument. Philosophy was the composition. He shaped both with unwavering patience, producing works that future thinkers, from Avicenna to Maimonides, would study like maps to greater knowledge. His intellectual legacy emerged from a life devoted to order, clarity, and truth. He proved that the mind, disciplined by logic and elevated by philosophy, could become a vessel for universal understanding. And in doing so, he left behind not just books, but a method, an enduring pathway for those who, like him, believed that wisdom is not discovered in a moment, but built thought by thought, argument by argument, until it stands complete like a city of light. The encounter with Aristotle's works marked a turning point in Al-Farabi's intellectual formation. He first approached the Greek texts as a seeker rather than a follower, recognizing in them a system of reasoning built like a cathedral. Every concept supported by another, every step toward knowledge guided by logic rather than tradition. Baghdad's libraries carried translations of the Organon, the Metaphysics, and fragments of Platonic dialogues, all of which Farabi studied with a deliberate intensity. He did not simply read Aristotle, he interrogated him. Page by page, he traced the structure of the arguments, searching for the pulse behind the words, the logic beneath the language. Greek philosophy became not a distant heritage, but a living conversation, one he intended to join. As Farabi's understanding deepened, he became one of the rare scholars who could connect Aristotelian rationalism with Islamic intellectual tradition without bending either out of form. He translated, commented, and clarified the most intricate sections of Greek thought, often illuminating passages that scholars before him had found impenetrable. His treatises were not summaries, but refoundations. He developed a vocabulary that made Greek logic accessible to Arabic-speaking students, refining terminology so that philosophical distinctions that once blurred became sharply defined. In lecture halls, when he reconstructed an Aristotelian argument step by step, the listeners witnessed not the echo of an ancient thinker, but the rebirth of an idea across centuries. Yet Farabi did not limit himself to Aristotle alone. Plato's vision of the virtuous society, the Stoics' understanding of reason, and the Pythagorean relationship between number and harmony all entered his intellectual bloodstream. He compared, synthesized, and reinterpreted these currents into a single philosophical body. It was here that his originality became visible. He accepted Aristotle as the first teacher, but he also identified the spaces where Aristotle's system required expansion, especially in politics, music, and the psychology of the human intellect. Where Aristotle had laid foundations, Farabi built structures. The Greek inheritance did not contain him. It gave him ground to stand upon as he reached further. His synthesis of Greek and Islamic thought ultimately became one of the most influential bridges in intellectual history. Through Farabi, Aristotle reached the scholars of Persia, Andalusia, and later Europe with clarity and renewed force. Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and countless others would one day rely not only on Aristotle's original arguments, but on Farabi's interpretations that revealed their deeper architecture. Greek thought, in his hands, was neither foreign nor ancient. It was present, sharpened, living. He proved that philosophy could cross languages, faiths, and empires when carried by a mind disciplined enough to grasp its essence. The legacy of Aristotle traveled through time not as a preserved relic, but as a flame. And Al-Farabi was the scholar who ensured it continued to burn. Al-Farabi's contributions extended far beyond philosophy. He became one of the most versatile thinkers of his age, moving with ease between sound, speech, and structured reasoning. His treatises on music, language, and logic reflect a mind that saw patterns in all things, mathematical in rhythm, lyrical in expression, and precise in argument. Where others studied disciplines as independent territories, Farabi approached them as interconnected provinces of a single intellectual empire. He believed that understanding any art or science required identifying its underlying order, and much of his writing was an effort to map that order for future generations. In music, his Kitab al-Musika al-Kabir stands as a monumental achievement. Unlike earlier works that described instruments or performance alone, Farabi analyzed sound mathematically, identifying intervals, tonal scales, and the relationship between pitch and physical vibration. He treated melody like architecture, constructed through proportion, symmetry, and structure. Baghdad's vibrant soundscape provided raw material for his study, from court orchestras to market musicians. Farabi listened not merely to enjoy, but to decode. His research transformed music from a performing art into a systematic science, shaping later traditions in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. For centuries, students approached music theory through doors Farabi had opened. Equally significant were his works on language and grammar. Farabi explored how words carry meaning, how the mind forms concepts from symbols, and how language becomes a vessel for logic. He compared linguistic structures across cultures, analyzing how different grammatical systems organize thought. In his treatises, he showed that language was not only a tool for communication, but a mirror of the intellect. By understanding how sentences are built, one could understand how ideas are shaped. His theories later influenced Arabic linguistic studies, laying foundations for scholars who expanded grammar into a philosophical science. Logic remained the core that unified these domains. Farabi developed commentaries and original works that sharpened the tools of reasoning, refining syllogistic methods and demonstrating how logical principles could govern everything from argument to melody. To him, logic was the compass of the intellect, the discipline that ensured thought remained true, structured, and coherent. He wrote with the calm confidence of one who had tested each rule against observation and debate. His books became standard references for generations, studied by jurists, philosophers, and scientists who relied on logic to anchor their inquiries. Through his writings, Al-Farabi gave form to knowledge itself. Music gained mathematical clarity, language acquired philosophical depth, and logic became a guiding thread connecting every field of learning. His works endured because they were not merely records of information, but frameworks capable of growth. They stand today as evidence of a scholar who heard harmony in theory, saw structure in speech, and built logic into a bridge connecting all intellectual pursuits. Al-Farabi's reputation as a scholar eventually carried him beyond the libraries of Baghdad, into the political and intellectual circles of powerful courts. The Samanid dynasty, ruling over parts of Transoxiana and Khorasan, recognized in him not merely a philosopher, but a man capable of refining scholarship into policy, cultural direction, and intellectual prestige. When he first entered their orbit, he was greeted not as a court entertainer, but as a thinker whose presence could elevate the scholarly rank of a kingdom. Within Samanid gatherings, he participated in debates on governance, ethics, and the role of knowledge in shaping society. He observed how rulers balanced authority with scholarship, how poets sought patronage, and how scientific inquiry competed with political necessity. Though he never pursued wealth, his influence grew quietly, like ink spreading across parchment. During this period, Farabi's insights found practical expression. He advised on education, the development of libraries, and the organization of scholarly circles where logic, mathematics, astronomy, and language flourished together rather than in isolation. The Samanid court valued Persian literary culture, and Farabi, with his multilingual background, linked Arabic philosophy with emerging Persian scholarship. His presence encouraged the production of translations, commentaries, and structured teaching systems that later helped transform Central Asia into one of the intellectual engines of the Islamic world. The work was subtle, rarely recorded in grand anecdotes, but it strengthened the roots of knowledge in regions far from Baghdad's center. Yet it was under the Hamdanid dynasty, particularly in Aleppo, that Farabi reached the height of his political and cultural engagement. Saif al-Dawla, the emir known for patronizing scholars and poets, welcomed Farabi into his circle as more than a guest. He regarded him as a guide, a philosopher whose clarity could shape the court's intellectual identity. In Aleppo, Farabi did not hide behind curtains of theory. He lectured openly, attended scholarly receptions, and reportedly conversed directly with the ruler on matters of statecraft and the ideal society. His works on political philosophy, especially those describing the virtues of a city governed by reason, reflect this experience. Al-Farabi envisioned a society where leadership rested not on birth, but on intellect and moral maturity, an echo both of Plato's philosopher king and of his own observations in the Hamdanid court. Despite the influence he held, Farabi remained famously ascetic. He accepted modest payment, lived simply, and often walked the court gardens more like a wandering scholar than a royal advisor. His years in service were never about power. They were about placing knowledge where it could flourish. The Samanid court gave him structure. The Hamdanid rulers gave him voice. Together, these periods shaped his political thought and gave him first-hand experience in governance, patronage culture, and the fragile connection between intellect and authority. When he later withdrew into quieter, scholarly life, he carried with him the insight of one who had seen wisdom applied, tested, and negotiated within the palace walls. Through service, Al-Farabi learned how ideas breathe when exposed to power, and how rare it is for power to listen. After years devoted to study and teaching, Al-Farabi's search for knowledge continued as movement. Long roads, new cities, unfamiliar voices. Damascus was the first great station of this later journey, a place where philosophy breathed through minarets, gardens, and quiet madrasa courtyards. He walked its stone streets not as a court scholar seeking patronage, but as a thinker observing the life of a city shaped by commerce, theology, poetry, and intellectual debate. In Damascus, he lectured regularly, exchanged knowledge with scholars, and spent long hours alone in study chambers where the sound of water fountains broke the silence like measured thought. The city, with its slow rhythm and ancient serenity, became a refuge for reflection, a place where ideas could be shaped without the noise of politics. From Damascus, Farabi traveled north to Aleppo, where the intellectual pulse beat faster and brighter. Saif al-Dawlah's court was a magnet for poets, mathematicians, linguists, and astronomers. The air itself felt charged with debate. Here, Farabi became a central figure not by force of personality, but by the gravity of his mind. His discussions in Aleppo were remembered not for drama, but for clarity. Arguments unfolded like architecture, precise and firm. The court gatherings often continued deep into the night, lamp flame dancing across polished manuscripts as Farabi demonstrated how logic could dismantle confusion like a craftsman splitting stone. Aleppo strengthened him not through solitude, but through challenge. It was here that he forged the political theories later written into works such as Al-Madina al-Fadila, a blueprint for the virtuous city built on knowledge, justice, and rational leadership. Egypt offered a different texture of learning, golden and ancient. When Farabi crossed into the Nile lands, he encountered a civilization layered with memory, pyramids older than empires, temples carved before Aristotle was ever born. He listened to scholars who studied medicine, astronomy, and geometry, with traditions reaching back to pharaonic priests. In crowded Cairo markets, he heard mathematical calculations disguised as bargaining, and in libraries he found manuscripts translating Greek heritage into Coptic and Arabic forms. The intellectual climate was rich but varied. Scientific, administrative, and mystical currents intertwined like branches of the river. Here, Farabi refined his ability to compare civilizations, to understand how knowledge survives through adaptation rather than preservation. Egypt reminded him that wisdom is ancient, yet always reborn. Through these travels, Farabi became a scholar with continents inside him. Damascus gave him silence for contemplation. Aleppo gave him debate to sharpen thought. Egypt gave him history older than reason itself. Each city added something to his mind that no book alone could offer. When he finally returned to the lands of Syria in the final period of his life, he carried with him the intellectual geography of the Islamic world. Ideas gathered like pearls across desert roads. His journey was not a wandering, but a weaving, each place a thread drawn into a single tapestry of thought. Travel shaped Al-Farabi into a philosopher of breadth and depth, one who understood that knowledge grows not only through reading, but through movement, encounter, and the long horizon of experience. Al-Farabi's intellectual legacy emerged through a remarkable body of writing that spanned logic, metaphysics, political theory, psychology, music, and linguistics. His works were not fragments of scattered thought, but interconnected frameworks, each text supporting another like stones in an arch. Among his most influential contributions stands Kitab al-Burhan, the Book of Demonstration, where he refined Aristotelian logic and established a systematic method for arriving at certainty. Here, he treated reasoning as an instrument of truth, portable across sciences, stable against dispute. In his logical treatises, he broke apart arguments the way an engineer studies gears, showing step by step how valid thought is constructed and how erroneous reasoning collapses under its own weight. These books became teaching manuals across the Islamic world, shaping scholars from Persia to Andalusia. Beyond logic, his metaphysical works revealed a thinker determined to chart the architecture of existence. In Al-Ilm al-Ilahi, the divine science, and related writings, Al-Farabi described a cosmos radiating from a first cause, pure, complete, and eternal. Knowledge, in his view, descended through successive intellects that governed the celestial spheres, ultimately reaching the human mind in graded illumination. He explored the nature of the soul, the structure of perception, and the ascent of reason toward understanding. His metaphysics was both rigorous and imaginative, a model of the universe where intellect and spirituality were not opposites, but partners. Later philosophers, most notably Ibn Sina, would build entire systems atop Farabi's metaphysical foundations, proof of their conceptual strength. His political works stand among the most daring achievements of medieval thought. In Al-Madina al-Fadila, the virtuous city, Farabi outlined an ideal society ruled by a philosopher leader whose wisdom created harmony between citizens, much as order governs the cosmos. The city he envisioned was not merely a political entity, it was a moral ecosystem where education cultivated virtue, reason guided law, and humanity progressed toward collective perfection. He compared different forms of governance, identified their strengths and failures, and examined how communities rise or fall according to the quality of their leaders. This treatise, often linked to Platonic influence, is uniquely Farabian in its fusion of Greek principles with Islamic ethical thought. It later shaped both Islamic and European discussions of the ideal state. Al-Farabi's output was vast, with more than 100 attributed works touching nearly every field of knowledge available in his time. His writings on music classified tonal structures and emotion. His language theory clarified how speech becomes meaning. His psychological texts probed imagination, perception, and cognition with striking precision. No subject remained isolated in his hands. Music resonated with mathematics. Politics reflected metaphysics. Logic disciplined every inquiry. His intellectual production became a bridge across centuries, transmitting the inheritance of antiquity into the flowering of Islamic philosophy, and ultimately into the intellectual revival of medieval Europe. Through his books, Al-Farabi did not merely record knowledge. He organized it, expanded it, and prepared it to travel beyond any single age or empire. Al-Farabi's idea of the ideal state emerged not from abstract speculation alone, but from decades of observation, travel, and the deep study of Plato and Aristotle. In his most celebrated political work, Al-Madina al-Fadila, The Virtuous City, he envisioned a society built on moral excellence, rational governance, and collective purpose. For Farabi, a truly successful state was one where citizens worked together like organs in a single body, each fulfilling its role with skill and harmony. The state was not merely a structure of authority, it was a living organism whose health depended on the virtue of its leader and the understanding of its people. Just as the intellect directs the soul, reason should guide the state, ensuring justice, order, and wisdom in every decision. At the center of Farabi's vision stood a leader unlike the kings of inheritance or generals of conquest. The ideal ruler was a philosopher, someone who had ascended intellectually to the highest level of understanding, grasping both the nature of existence and the needs of humanity. This ruler did not dominate through force, but illuminated through knowledge, guiding society toward happiness and moral perfection. Farabi described qualities this leader must possess: intelligence, fairness, courage, eloquence, and the ability to understand truth without distortion. Leadership, he believed, was not granted by birth, but earned through the cultivation of virtue and reason. The philosopher king was the bridge between divine order and social order. Below the ruler, Farabi outlined a carefully structured society where classes were organized according to talent and function. Scholars, judges, teachers, craftsmen, and laborers each held roles essential to the state's operation. Farabi did not propose equality of function, but equality of purpose. All served the greater good, though in different ways. Virtue, not wealth or status, defined a noble citizen. Education became the heart of the system, shaping individuals from childhood into rational, ethical beings. Through discipline, learning, and community cooperation, society could be elevated beyond survival into flourishing. The virtuous state, therefore, was a project of human development. Its goal not only prosperity, but enlightenment. Farabi also warned of failed states, contrasting them with the virtuous city. Societies driven by greed, vanity, or power would decay like diseased organs. Despotic rulers produced fear rather than harmony. Ignorant governance distorted the natural order of the state. In his political philosophy, one sees the influence of Greek thought, yet it is reshaped through Islamic ethical ideals and his own lived experience among courts. Farabi's ideal state was not a fantasy. It was a blueprint for civilization at its highest moral and intellectual potential. He believed that a society guided by reason could approach perfection, and that the philosopher's duty was to lead humanity toward truth as a shepherd leads a flock toward light. Through this vision, Al-Farabi left one of the most profound legacies in political thought. A dream of society as a symphony of virtue, guided by wisdom, sustained by justice, and forever reaching toward its better self. Al-Farabi stands as one of the most formative architects of philosophical development in the Islamic world, and through it, the intellectual history of humanity. He arrived at a moment when translation movements had revived Greek knowledge, but much of it remained disordered. Fragments of Aristotle, Plato, and later commentators circulated in scattered form. Farabi's genius lay not simply in reading these works, but in integrating them into a coherent intellectual system that could speak to Arabic scholars, Islamic theology, and emerging scientific inquiry. He turned philosophy into an organized discipline, clarifying its structure, purpose, and method. In doing so, he ensured that reason became a central pillar of Islamic scholarship and a tool for scientific progress. His influence radiated through law, theology, mathematics, and medicine, shaping scholars for centuries. Farabi helped position logic at the core of philosophical activity, a contribution that shifted the trajectory of Islamic intellectual life. Before him, logic was often treated as a foreign import, useful but not yet essential. Farabi redefined it as the universal instrument of truth, showing how every field, from theology to astronomy, depended on sound reasoning. He emphasized that faith and philosophy were not enemies, but partners. Revelation guided the soul, while logic guided the mind. This balance allowed Islamic philosophy to flourish without rejecting its spiritual foundation. Later thinkers, including Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, built their towering systems upon Farabi's foundations, while theologians adopted his methods even when they contested his conclusions. His influence extended far beyond the Islamic world. Through Andalusia, Farabi's writings entered Latin Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, shaping scholastic philosophy and laying groundwork for medieval rationalism. Thinkers such as Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas engaged deeply with concepts first clarified by Farabi: the hierarchy of intellects, the relationship between existence and essence, and the function of logical demonstration. In European universities, Farabi's commentaries circulated beside Aristotle's like necessary keys to unlock classical thought. He became a silent instructor in the classrooms of Paris, Toledo, and Bologna, his legacy crossing languages, empires, and centuries. The Renaissance inheritance of Greek philosophy was to a great extent filtered through Farabi's lens. Even beyond logic and metaphysics, Farabi contributed to a philosophical vision of human fulfillment that resonates in global thought. He saw the pursuit of knowledge as a moral duty, creativity as a natural extension of intellect, and society as a collaboration toward shared happiness. His synthesis of Greek rationality with Islamic ethical worldview produced a philosophy capable of accommodating science, spirituality, and political life within a single coherent frame. In this, his achievement was not to preserve the past, but to expand it, transforming ancient wisdom into a living tradition that could grow. Through his works, Al-Farabi became not only a bridge between civilizations, but a pillar in the foundation of world philosophy, proving that ideas can outlive empires, faiths, and ages when they speak to the universal striving of the human mind. In the final chapter of Al-Farabi's life, the scholar settled once more in Damascus, a city whose calm rhythm suited the reflective maturity of his later years. He chose a life that was quietly distant from the grandeur of courts, preferring modest lodging, simple food, and long walks through gardens and study halls. Scholars and students would often find him seated alone beneath a shaded archway or beside a small fountain, manuscript open before him, thought flowing like water over stone. This was not withdrawal, but refinement, a stage in which he distilled decades of travel, discourse, and contemplation into a serene and disciplined existence. Damascus offered him space to think without distraction, to write without interruption, and to teach without spectacle. During these years, he continued to receive visitors, poets, philosophers, jurists, and young students curious about the man called the Second Teacher. They came to him not for wealth or position, but for clarity. Farabi spoke softly, but with the precision of a craftsman who understood the weight of every concept. He offered guidance in logic, counsel in ethics, and commentary on texts that others had long struggled to decode. In Damascus, he produced some of his last writings, reviewing earlier works and refining conclusions drawn across a lifetime. His teachings became more distilled, like light narrowed through a lens, fewer words, greater depth. Those who studied with him carried his methodology forward, preserving both his ideas and his discipline of thought. His final period was marked by a remarkable humility. Unlike many scholars whose fame grew with age, Farabi remained detached from honor. Stories describe him walking the city in simple garments, refusing luxury even when it was offered. Knowledge, he believed, was not enhanced by comfort, nor wisdom by wealth. When he accepted patronage, it was only enough to meet basic needs, never more. He lived almost monastically, dividing his days between study, teaching, and contemplation. Damascus, in this sense, was not a closing chapter but a culmination. Here, his philosophy of the virtuous life took form in the quiet discipline of his own routine. Al-Farabi died in Damascus around 950 CE, leaving behind neither riches nor monuments, only manuscripts, memories, and a chain of intellectual inheritance that would shape civilizations. His burial was modest, attended by those who knew him as both scholar and guide. Yet the simplicity of his death belied the magnitude of his legacy. In the stillness of Damascus, where he spent his last years in contemplation, the work of a lifetime matured like fruit at its fullest sweetness. Farabi's final days were lived not in decline, but in completion. A life that began on the steps of Farab ended in the quiet chambers of a city devoted to knowledge, and from that quiet grew a voice that history has never silenced. Al-Farabi's death in 950 CE marked the end of a remarkable journey, yet it was only the beginning of his life in memory. He died in Damascus, quietly and without ceremony, in keeping with the simplicity that had defined his final years. No palace walls enclosed his last breath, no armies marched in his name. Instead, his passing resembled the slow extinguishing of a lamp at dawn, soft, natural, and without disturbance. Those who laid him to rest knew they were burying not merely a scholar, but a mind that had gathered the wisdom of continents. His grave was modest, but the ideas he left behind would rise far higher than stone or marble could ever reach. In the decades after his death, Farabi's writings traveled further than he ever could in life. Manuscripts moved westward into Persia and eastward across the courts of Khorasan, where students copied his works by lamplight and debated his logic long after midnight. His method of commentary transformed Aristotle into a teacher for a new age, while his original insights merged Greek rationalism with Islamic ethical worldview. It was through this synthesis that Farabi became the foundational pillar of a philosophical tradition that soon produced leading thinkers like Ibn Sina, who called him the greatest master in logic. Across generations, students approached Farabi not as a historical memory, but as a voice still speaking through ink and thought. His influence eventually crossed language and faith, flowing into Andalusian scholarship, and from there into Latin Europe. Translations of his works reached medieval universities, where they shaped the intellectual architecture of scholasticism. Christian theologians such as Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas engaged deeply with Farabi's metaphysics and political theory, not as foreign texts, but as essential guides to reason. Through the corridors of Toledo and Paris, his ideas moved like a river beneath stone. quiet yet unstoppable. He became a philosopher without borders, connecting civilizations that believed themselves separate, reminding them of their shared pursuit of truth. What remains most enduring is not the quantity of his books, but the structure of thought he left behind. Farabi showed that knowledge could be systemized without killing its spirit, that philosophy could coexist with faith, and that logic could elevate society rather than divide it. His dream of the virtuous city continues to echo in discussions of leadership and ethical governance. His theories of intellect inspire metaphysics, still debated today. His approach to logic forms the backbone of scholarly reasoning across cultures. Farabi's legacy is a constellation stretching across centuries, visible to anyone who looks upward with a seeking mind. Though his body returned to the earth of Damascus, his thought became part of the intellectual sky, guiding seekers of wisdom like stars guide travelers through the night.